For 4 decades, Margaret Sullivan believed her marriage was an impenetrable fortress. She had built a life, raised 3 children, and poured every ounce of her soul into her husband Richard's success. But on a rainy Tuesday, just 3 days after her 60th birthday, that fortress crumbled into dust. Richard didn't just leave her, he erased her. The bank accounts were emptied, the family home was secretly mortgaged to the hilt, and 40 years of unwavering loyalty left her with exactly $84 and a foreclosure notice. She was utterly destroyed until she found the key to a door Richard thought he had buried forever. The morning the world ended smelled of roasted Colombian coffee and lemon polish. Margaret Maggie, to her friends, was humming softly in the kitchen of her Oak Park, Illinois home. The house, a sprawling 4-bedroom Victorian with wraparound porches, was the physical manifestation of her life's work. She had painstakingly restored the original woodwork, chosen every curtain, and raised 3 children within its walls. She and Richard had bought it in 1990, back when Sullivan Contracting was just Richard, a beat-up Ford truck, and Maggie doing the bookkeeping at the dining room table late into the night. At 9:15 the doorbell rang. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron, expecting a package. Instead, she found a young man in a damp windbreaker standing on her porch, clutching a manila envelope. "Margaret Sullivan?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes? You've been served." He thrust the envelope against her chest, turned on his heel, and walked briskly back to a nondescript sedan. Maggie stood frozen on the porch as the cold October rain began to mist against her face. She looked down at the envelope. Her hands trembled as she tore the seal. The legal jargon blurred together, but 2 words jumped off the page, sharp and jagged. Dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Richard Thomas Sullivan. It had to be a mistake. Richard was on a business trip in Denver. They had just celebrated his 65th birthday with a lavish dinner at a steakhouse downtown. He had kissed her forehead before leaving for the airport and told her to call the plumber about the guest bathroom sink. Men who are planning to divorce their wives of 40 years do not remind them to fix the plumbing. She rushed to the kitchen phone and dialed his cell. It went straight to voicemail. She dialed his office. His secretary, a young woman named Brittany, answered with a hesitant, breathy voice. "Brittany, it's Maggie. I need to speak to Richard immediately. There's been some kind of terrible mistake." A heavy, suffocating silence hung on the line. "Mrs. Sullivan," Brittany finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Mr. Sullivan doesn't work here anymore. He sold his shares in the company last week. He told us he was retiring." The phone slipped from Maggie's hand, clattering against the hardwood floor. Over the next 48 hours, Maggie descended into a bureaucratic nightmare. Driven by a rising panic, she drove to her local Chase Bank branch. She sat in the glass-walled office of a branch manager she had known for 10 years. The manager, a kind-eyed woman named Brenda, looked at her computer screen, her face draining of color. "Maggie," Brenda said softly, sliding a printed statement across the desk. "The joint savings account was closed yesterday. The checking account has a balance of $84.12. "Closed? By who?" Maggie gasped, clutching the edge of the mahogany desk to steady herself. "Where did the money go?" "We had over $400,000 in that savings account. It was our retirement fund. Richard authorized a wire transfer to an external account," Brenda explained, her voice thick with pity. "And Maggie, I see here that there is a secondary mortgage on the house, taken out 3 months ago, for $600,000. The first payment was missed last week." Maggie couldn't breathe. The room spun. 40 years. She had met Richard when she was 22, working as a receptionist. She had dropped out of night school to support him while he built his business. She had managed the household, entertained his clients, and trusted him implicitly with their finances. She had never asked to see the bank statements. Richard had always patted her hand and said, "Don't worry your pretty head, Maggie. I've got us taken care of." He had taken care of her, all right. He had meticulously, systematically dismantled their life, liquidating assets, taking out loans against their home, and siphoning the cash into the ether. He had left her with nothing but debts she couldn't pay and a house she was about to lose. On the third day, Richard finally called. His voice was calm, businesslike, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had known for 4 decades. "Maggie," he said. "Richard, where are you? What have you done?" she sobbed, collapsing onto the sofa. "The business was failing, Maggie." He lied smoothly. "We were drowning. I had to liquidate to pay off bad debts. There's nothing left. I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I'm starting over. The lawyers will handle the rest. You took a mortgage on the house. You drained the accounts. Where did you go?" Click. The line went dead. Maggie sat in the silence of the massive, empty house. The illusion of her life had shattered, leaving behind jagged shards of reality. She was 62 years old, unemployed for 35 years, penniless and alone. "He didn't just leave you, Mrs. Sullivan. He executed a financial assassination." David Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a gold pen against his notepad. David was a family law attorney in downtown Chicago, recommended by Maggie's eldest son, Thomas. David had a reputation for being ruthless in court, but as he looked across the desk at the hollow-eyed, trembling woman before him, his demeanor was surprisingly gentle. It had been 3 weeks since the divorce papers arrived. Maggie had lost 15 pounds. Her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and the vibrant light that used to animate her face had been extinguished. Spread across David's desk were stacks of financial documents, the autopsy reports of Maggie's marriage. "Here is what the forensic accountant found," David said, pointing to a highlighted spreadsheet. "Richard started planning this exactly 5 years ago. That's when the statute of limitations on certain financial transfers begins to get murky. He began making aggressive, seemingly foolish investments through the company. He'd buy materials at a premium from a third-party vendor. The company took the loss, but the vendor was an LLC registered in Delaware. He was stealing from his own company?" Maggie asked, struggling to grasp the mechanics of the betrayal. "He was funneling money out of the marital estate," David corrected gently. "He washed the money through these dummy corporations. Then came the home equity line of credit. He forged your signature on the secondary mortgage documents. Because he had a power of attorney, you signed back in 2012 when you had your gallbladder surgery. The bank accepted it." Tears pricked Maggie's eyes. The betrayal was so thorough, so calculated. Every time he had kissed her goodnight, every time they had celebrated an anniversary, he had been plotting her ruin. "Can't we track the money? Can't we freeze his accounts?" she pleaded. David sighed heavily. "We are trying. But the money he wired out the day before he served you, it went to a bank in the Cayman Islands, and from there, it vanished into a web of offshore accounts. We can fight this in court, Maggie. We can prove fraud, but it will take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, fees you don't have, and frankly, fees you shouldn't borrow, because even if we win a judgment, collecting it from a man who has successfully hidden his assets is nearly impossible." "So he gets away with it," Maggie whispered, staring at her hands. "He takes 40 years of my life, takes every dime we built together, and he just gets away with it. I am going to do everything in my power to ensure he doesn't," David said firmly. "But I have to be honest with you about your immediate reality. The bank is moving forward with the foreclosure on the Oak Park house. Because Richard took the money and defaulted, they have the right to take the property. You have 30 days to vacate." The words struck her like physical blows. 30 days. 30 days to pack up 40 years of memories, raise her children, and leave the only sanctuary she had ever known. The following weeks were a blur of cardboard boxes and packing tape. Her children, Thomas, Sarah, and Mark, were furious, but they had their own lives, their own mortgages, and young children. They offered her their spare bedrooms, but Maggie couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden, a tragic cautionary tale sleeping on an air mattress in her daughter's home office. Friends she had known for decades suddenly became distant. The wives she used to play tennis with didn't know what to say, so they said nothing, quietly excusing themselves from her life. Divorce is contagious, they seemed to think, and financial ruin is a disease they didn't want to catch. Maggie spent her days selling off her life. The antique dining table went to a consignment shop. The jewelry Richard had given her over the years, which turned out to be mostly cubic zirconia and low-carat gold, another quiet deception, was pawned for pennies on the dollar. Every night, she slept on a mattress on the floor of the empty master bedroom, listening to the house settle, mourning the ghost of a man who had never really existed. By the final week, the house was stripped bare, echoing with emptiness. Only the attic remained. Richard had always hated the attic. He claimed it was too dusty, too cramped. It was where Maggie kept the kids' old school projects, holiday decorations, and family heirlooms. She dreaded going up there. It was the graveyard of their family history. But with only 3 days left before the bank changed the locks, she had no choice. She grabbed a roll of heavy-duty trash bags and pulled the pull-down cord to the attic stairs, stepping into the dusty, suffocating heat of her past. The attic smelled of mothballs and dried lavender. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing through the small octagonal window at the far end of the room. Maggie moved methodically, her heart numb, tossing Christmas ornaments and old winter coats into donation boxes. In the darkest corner, tucked behind a broken rocking chair, sat a heavy, iron-bound cedar chest. It had belonged to Richard's father, a bitter, hard-drinking man who had passed away 20 years ago. Richard had shoved it up here after the funeral and explicitly told Maggie never to touch it. "Just old junk of my old man's," he had said dismissively. "Leave it be." For 20 years, she had obeyed. But Maggie was no longer the obedient wife. She dragged the chest out into the light. It was locked with a heavy brass padlock. In the past, she would have left it alone. Today, she went downstairs, retrieved a heavy claw hammer from the kitchen utility drawer, and marched back up. With a surge of pent-up rage at Richard, rage at the lawyers, rage at herself for being so blind, she brought the hammer down on the padlock. Once, twice. On the third strike, the metal groaned and the lock snapped open. Maggie threw back the lid. It wasn't filled with Richard's father's things. There were no old war medals or dusty boots. Instead, the chest was meticulously organized, filled with hanging file folders. Maggie frowned, pulling out the first folder. It contained old tax returns from the late 1990s. The next folder held utility bills from 2005. It seemed to be nothing more than an archive of mundane financial records, the overflow of Richard's home office. She spent an hour sifting through the papers, finding nothing but useless receipts. Disappointed, she began to shove the folders back into the chest. As she pushed a stack of files to the back, her fingers brushed against something hard taped to the inside wall of the chest. She paused. Feeling along the cedar wood, she found a thick, manila envelope taped securely to the back panel, hidden beneath the hanging folders. She peeled the tape away. The envelope was surprisingly heavy. Maggie sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead. She opened the flap and poured the contents onto the dusty floorboards. 3 items tumbled out. The first was a heavy, antique-looking brass key, attached to a faded leather keychain. The second was a glossy brochure for a place called Pine Ridge Marina in a town she had never heard of, Blackwood, Maine. The third was a thick stack of legal documents stapled together. Maggie picked up the documents. Her eyes scanned the first page. It was a property deed. Recorded, the 14th of August, 2018. Grantor, the estate of Silas Vance. No, wait. Strike that. The estate of Silas Montgomery. Grantee. Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. Property address: 442 Whispering Pines Road, Blackwood, Maine. Maggie stared at the paper, her brow furrowed. 2018. That was 5 years ago. the exact time David Sterling said Richard began his meticulous plan to hide his assets. She flipped to the second page, a property tax receipt from the previous year. It showed the taxes were paid in full, in cash, by a cashier's check, but it was the signature on the bottom of the LLC formation document, included in the packet, that made Maggie's heart stop. The signature didn't belong to Richard Sullivan. It was signed by Cynthia Hayes. Maggie recognized the name instantly. Cynthia Hayes was the interior designer Richard had hired back in 2017 to redesign the corporate offices of Sullivan Builders. Maggie had met her once at a company Christmas party, a striking woman in her early 40s with sharp features and a perfectly tailored suit. Richard had always dismissed her as too demanding and difficult to work with. A wave of nausea washed over Maggie. It hadn't just been a financial betrayal. It was a complete and utter double life. Richard and Cynthia. They had formed a shell company. They had bought property in Maine. Maggie grabbed her cell phone from her pocket and called David Sterling. "David, it's Maggie," she breathed, her voice shaking. "I found something. In the attic." "Maggie, what is it?" "A deed to a property in Blackwood, Maine, owned by an LLC called Blue Heron Holdings, and a key." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Maine? Maggie, are you sure?" "We ran a nationwide property search on Richard's name and his known corporate entities." "It's not in his name," Maggie said, her voice hardening, the numbness finally giving way to a cold, sharp clarity. "It's signed by Cynthia Hayes, the interior designer he supposedly hated." David was silent for a long moment. "Maggie, if he used marital funds to purchase that property, even under a dummy LLC with his mistress, that is a recoverable asset. But proving he is the actual beneficiary, and not just Cynthia, that's going to be incredibly difficult from Chicago. We'd need to subpoena the LLC records, hire local counsel in Maine." "David," Maggie interrupted. She looked down at the heavy brass key resting in the palm of her hand. It felt warm, solid. It felt like the only real thing she had touched in weeks. "I don't have money for local counsel in Maine. I don't have money for anything. Maggie, don't do anything rash." "I have a car that still runs," Maggie said, her eyes fixed on the glossy brochure of the marina. "And I have $84, plus a credit card with a $500 limit that he forgot to cancel." "Maggie, listen to me. You cannot just drive to Maine. You don't know what's there. You don't know if they are there. I have to be out of this house in 3 days, David." "I have nowhere to go," Maggie said, a strange, terrifying sense of calm washing over her. She gripped the brass key tightly. "Richard took my past. He took my present. But I'll be damned if I let him and his mistress sit comfortably in a house bought with my blood and sweat. I'm going to Blackwood." She hung up the phone before David could argue. She looked around the dusty attic one last time. For 40 years, she had been Margaret Sullivan, the agreeable wife, the quiet bookkeeper, the woman who stayed in the background and let her husband shine. That woman had died the day the process server knocked on the door. Maggie packed a single suitcase. She took her birth certificate, her passport, the legal documents she had found in the chest, and the heavy brass key. She left the keys to the Oak Park house on the kitchen counter for the bank. She walked out the front door, didn't look back, and got into her 10-year-old Honda Civic. She put the car in drive and pointed the headlights east, toward a town she had never seen, to find a house no one knew existed. The drive from Chicago to Blackwood, Maine, took 26 grueling hours. Maggie drove until her vision blurred, sleeping in the cramped back seat of her Honda in brightly lit truck stops, surviving on lukewarm diner coffee and stale crackers. Every mile that rolled beneath her tires stripped away another layer of the compliant, naive woman she had been. Blackwood was not the rustic, blue-collar fishing village she had pictured. As she crossed the town line late on a Thursday afternoon, a dense coastal fog rolling off the Atlantic, she realized Blackwood was a sanctuary for the ultra-rich, Winding coastal roads were lined with high stone walls and discreet security cameras. There were no generic grocery stores, only artisanal markets and boutique wine shops. Her GPS lost signal twice before she finally found Whispering Pines Road. It wasn't a street. It was a private, unpaved driveway shrouded by towering, ancient evergreens. At the entrance stood a heavy wrought-iron gate. Maggie's heart sank. She pulled up to the keypad. She didn't have a code. Frustration prickled at the corners of her eyes, but then she noticed a small, manual override keyhole at the base of the call box. Hands trembling, she took the heavy brass key she had found in the attic. She slid it into the lock and turned. With a mechanical groan, the massive iron gates slowly swung open. She drove up the winding, half-mile driveway, the dense forest finally breaking to reveal a cliffside overlooking the churning gray ocean. And there, perched on the edge of the world, was the house. It was a staggering architectural marvel of slate, reclaimed timber, and floor-to-ceiling glass. It looked like a spread from Architectural Digest, sleek, modern, and radiating quiet, arrogant wealth. There were 3 garage bays and a wraparound deck that seemed to float above the crashing waves below. Maggie parked her battered Honda next to a pristine, silver Range Rover. She killed the engine and just sat there, the rhythmic thud of the ocean vibrating through the car. He had told her they couldn't afford to fix the leaky roof in Oak Park. He had complained about the cost of their daughter's modest wedding. Yet, here stood a multi-million-dollar estate, bought with the money she had helped earn, scrubbed floors for, and sacrificed her youth to build. She stepped out into the biting sea breeze. She walked to the heavy oak front door, bypassing the digital keypad, and inserted the brass key into the deadbolt. It clicked perfectly. Maggie pushed the door open and stepped into her husband's secret life. The interior was a masterclass in Cynthia Hayes' signature aesthetic, cold, minimalist, and unforgivingly expensive. The floors were radiant heated polished concrete. A massive, floating glass staircase dominated the foyer. The living room featured a pale, curved sectional sofa facing a monolithic stone fireplace. Maggie walked slowly through the rooms, her worn sneakers silent on the floor. It was immaculate, but it wasn't empty. A half-empty bottle of sparkling water sat on the granite kitchen island. A cashmere throw was tossed carelessly across a reading chair. The scent of an expensive, smoky vanilla perfume hung faintly in the air. Someone had been here very recently. She made her way up the glass stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. She bypassed the master bedroom. She couldn't stomach looking at the king-sized bed just yet and moved straight toward a room at the end of the hall that looked like an office. The office had a panoramic view of the Atlantic, but Maggie's eyes immediately locked onto the sleek mahogany desk. Sitting on top of it was a state-of-the-art laptop, closed, and a stack of mail. She walked over and flipped through the envelopes. They were all addressed to Blue Heron Holdings, LLC, care of Cynthia Hayes. Not a single piece of mail bore her husband's name. Maggie sat in the high-backed leather chair and opened the laptop. It required a password. She tried the husband's birthday. Nothing. She tried Cynthia's name. Nothing. She sat back, thinking. What was the one thing both of them shared? The LLC. She typed Blue Heron 2018. The screen unlocked. For the next 2 hours, Maggie didn't move. She navigated through the computer's files, a cold, surgical precision taking over her mind. What she found was a labyrinth of offshore accounts, but more importantly, she found the internal communications between Cynthia and the Cayman Islands Bank. The money her husband had wired out of their joint accounts in Chicago had indeed gone to the Caymans, but it hadn't stayed there. According to the digital ledgers Cynthia had carelessly left on the desktop, Cynthia had been quietly siphoning funds from the primary Cayman account into a private Swiss account under her own maiden name. Maggie read an email draft Cynthia had saved just 3 days ago. It was addressed to an immigration attorney in Geneva, discussing the purchase of a chalet and securing residency. A dark, bitter laugh escaped Maggie's lips. Her husband had destroyed his marriage, bankrupted his wife, and burned his life to the ground to run away with Cynthia. But Cynthia was currently robbing him blind, preparing to leave him with absolutely nothing, just as he had done to Maggie. He was a fool who had been outplayed by a younger, sharper grifter. But Cynthia had made one fatal mistake. She had left the original LLC formation documents, the ones proving the marital funds were used to establish Blue Heron Holdings, in that old cedar chest in Chicago, likely assuming the husband had destroyed them. The crunch of tires on gravel snapped Maggie out of her trance. She looked out the office window. A black Mercedes sedan had just pulled up the driveway, parking behind Maggie's Honda. The driver's side door opened, and Cynthia Hayes stepped out, wearing a camel hair coat, a pair of oversized sunglasses, and a look of absolute fury as she stared at the unfamiliar car in her driveway. Maggie didn't panic. She didn't hide. She calmly printed out the ledger showing the Swiss bank transfers, folded the papers into her pocket, and walked slowly down the glass staircase. By the time she reached the foyer, the front door swung open. Cynthia stood in the doorway, her keys still in her hand, freezing as she saw the older woman standing in the center of the living room. "Margaret?" Cynthia breathed, pulling off her sunglasses. The shock on her perfectly contoured face was palpable. "How on earth did you get past the gate? How are you inside my house?" "It's funny you call it your house, Cynthia," Maggie said, her voice smooth and unnervingly calm. She walked over to the wet bar, picked up a crystal decanter, and poured herself 2 fingers of amber liquid. She didn't even know what it was, but she needed something to do with her hands, especially since it was bought with the $400,000 missing from my retirement account. Cynthia's shock quickly morphed into a cold, practiced sneer. She stepped inside and slammed the door shut. "You need to leave, right now. You are trespassing. I will call the local police, and I promise you, they don't look kindly on vagrants harassing the residents." "Call them," Maggie challenged, taking a sip of the liquor. It burned her throat, fortifying her. "Let's have a chat with the police about Blue Heron Holdings. Let's talk about the original deed and the LLC incorporation papers I have in my possession, the ones your lawyer forgot to file properly, leaving the chain of custody pointing directly back to a fraudulent wire transfer from Chicago." Cynthia hesitated, her hand hovering over her phone. "Tom handled the paperwork," she snapped, slipping up and using the name he sometimes went by in business circles. "Whatever mess he made, it's between you and him. The house is in my name." "It's in an LLC," Maggie corrected, taking a step closer. "An LLC that is currently subject to a marital asset freeze ordered by a judge in Cook County yesterday afternoon. It was a bluff, but David the lawyer had promised to file it soon." Cynthia didn't need to know the timeline. "You're pathetic, Margaret," Cynthia spat, crossing her arms. "He doesn't love you. He hasn't loved you for a decade. He's in Belize right now, finalizing a deal, and as soon as he gets back, we are leaving the country. You can't touch us. You have no money to fight us." "You're right." "I don't," Maggie agreed softly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded printouts. She tossed them onto the pale sectional sofa. "But he might want to fight you." Cynthia's eyes darted to the papers. She didn't move to pick them up, but her posture stiffened. "I was just looking at your laptop upstairs," Maggie continued, pacing slowly around the room. "Fascinating reading. The Swiss accounts? Geneva? It looks like you've moved about 80% of his, our stolen money into your private accounts over the last 48 hours. Accounts he doesn't have access to." All the color drained from Cynthia's face. The arrogant facade shattered, leaving a panicked, cornered animal in its wake. "He's in Belize, waiting for you, isn't he?" Maggie asked, a ruthless smile playing on her lips. "He thinks he's retiring as a king, but you're about to leave him there with an empty bank account and a voided passport, aren't you?" Cynthia swallowed hard. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Maggie interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You are a thief who stole from a thief, and right now, I am the only person on this earth who knows about it. What do you want? Cynthia asked, her voice shaking. I want my life back, Maggie said. But since you two destroyed it, I'll settle for this one. She gestured around the magnificent glass house. You want the house? Cynthia laughed nervously. You can't maintain this property. The taxes alone. I don't care about the taxes. I care about the equity, Maggie snapped. Here is what is going to happen, Cynthia. You are going to call your attorney right now. You are going to sign a quitclaim deed transferring sole ownership of Blue Heron Holdings and this property directly to me, irrevocably. And if you don't, Maggie said, pulling her cell phone from her pocket. I hit send on an email containing these ledgers, addressed to him in Belize, to my divorce attorney in Chicago, and to the IRS Fraud Division. You won't make it to Geneva. You'll make it to federal prison. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the crashing of the ocean waves against the cliffs outside. Cynthia stared at the older woman, realizing for the first time that the quiet, submissive wife she had so easily dismissed was gone. In her place stood a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. The silence in the sprawling, oceanfront living room was thick enough to choke on. The interior designer stared at Maggie, her manicured hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the polished concrete island in the kitchen. She was calculating her odds, weighing the absolute destruction of her carefully laid plans against the very real threat of federal prison. You wouldn't actually send those ledgers to the IRS, the younger woman scoffed, though her voice lacked its earlier venom. You'd be tying up your own marital assets in an international fraud investigation for the next decade. You'd get nothing. Maggie smiled a cold, practiced expression that didn't reach her eyes. I already have nothing. My house in Chicago goes to the bank on Tuesday. My checking account holds less than $100. I am a 62-year-old woman with a suitcase and a car that barely runs. The difference between us is that I am no longer afraid of the bottom. You, on the other hand, are terrified of it. Maggie tapped her fingernail against the printouts resting on the counter. I send these, and the authorities freeze the Swiss accounts immediately. Your Geneva chalet evaporates. Your entire future disappears. Or you call your corporate attorney right now, and you sign over 100% of the membership interest in Blue Heron Holdings to me. You walk out that door, get in your car, and you never look back. You keep whatever millions you siphoned off to Switzerland, and I keep this house. Consider it my severance package. The designer's eyes darted frantically around the magnificent glass fortress she had designed for herself. She had orchestrated the perfect crime, manipulating an older, wealthy man into liquidating his life's work, only to steal the spoils from him at the finish line. But she had made the fatal error of underestimating the wife he had discarded. With a ragged sigh of defeat, the younger woman pulled her cell phone from her designer handbag. It took 3 agonizing hours. A local mobile notary, a quiet, older gentleman named Mr. Walsh, was summoned to the property. He sat at the mahogany desk in the upstairs office, completely oblivious to the sheer gravity of the extortion taking place. He stamped and signed the heavy parchment documents, officially transferring sole ownership of Blue Heron Holdings, and thereby the multi-million-dollar main estate, into Maggie's name. As the notary packed his briefcase and left, the designer dragged 2 large Louis Vuitton suitcases down the glass staircase. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at Maggie. She simply walked out the heavy oak front door, loaded her luggage into the waiting black Mercedes, and drove away, the crunch of the tires fading into the roar of the Atlantic Ocean. Maggie locked the deadbolt. She stood alone in the cavernous foyer, listening to the absolute stillness of the house. It was hers, fully, legally, and irrevocably hers. She walked into the master bathroom, turned on the rain shower, and finally, for the first time in a month, allowed herself to collapse onto the imported Italian tiles and weep. She cried for the 40 years she had given to a phantom. She cried for the cruel, callous way she had been discarded. And then, As the hot water washed away the dust of the road, the tears stopped. A fierce, burning resolve took their place. Over the next 2 weeks, Maggie transformed. She sold the designer's abandoned custom furniture to a high-end consignment dealer in Boston, using the cash to hire a local security firm to change the gate codes, upgrade the camera systems, and secure the perimeter. She contacted her attorney back in Chicago, sending him a secure copy of the newly minted LLC documents. "I don't know how you pulled this off, Maggie," her attorney had said over the phone, awe evident in his voice. "But you own it free and clear. There is no mortgage. The property taxes are paid through the next 2 years. It's an absolute fortress." "It's not just a fortress," Maggie replied, looking out over the churning gray ocean. "It's a trap, and we are just waiting for the mouse." 3,000 miles away from the freezing coastline of Maine, the trap had already sprung, though the prey was still blissfully unaware. The air in San Pedro, Belize, was thick with tropical humidity and the intoxicating scent of overripe papaya and sea salt. William Sullivan lounged in a hand-carved teakwood chair on the private terrace of his expansive suite at the Las Terrazas resort. He was 65, deeply tanned, and wearing a crisp, white linen shirt that had cost more than his first automobile. He held a crystal tumbler filled with a generous pour of Ron Zacapa, 23 rum, the ice clinking softly against the glass as he looked out over the impossibly turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. He felt entirely invincible. He was a king who had successfully and ruthlessly abdicated his throne, taking the entire treasury with him to live in absolute paradise. William took a slow, savoring sip of the dark rum, letting the warmth spread through his chest. He had executed the perfect escape. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. The contracting business he had built in Chicago was successfully liquidated, leaving his creditors chasing ghosts. The sprawling Oak Park family home was secretly mortgaged to its absolute limit, the equity expertly extracted and washed through a labyrinth of Delaware shell corporations. He had cut the dead weight of his 40-year marriage to Eleanor with surgical, unapologetic precision. In his mind, she was a relic of his past, a quiet, unremarkable woman who had served her purpose and was no longer required for the vibrant, wealthy future he had designed. All that was left was for his beautiful, sharp-witted designer, Vanessa Croft, to arrive on the 4 o'clock puddle jumper flight from Miami, bringing with her the final access tokens to their newly established, untraceable offshore wealth. A discreet, hesitant cough interrupted his triumphant reverie. William lowered his glass and turned. Standing at the edge of the terrace was the resort's guest relations manager, a meticulously groomed man named Javier, wearing a strained, deeply apologetic smile. "Pardon the intrusion, Mr. Sullivan," Javier murmured, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "I hope the afternoon finds you well." "It finds me perfectly, Javier," William replied, waving a dismissive hand toward the breathtaking view. "Though I am expecting a guest shortly. I trust the private car is waiting at the airstrip?" "The car is standing by, sir. However, there is a slight administrative matter we must attend to," Javier said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the hushed tone reserved for uncomfortable situations with high net worth individuals. "The primary Centurion card you placed on file for the extended reservation and the incidental charges, it has been declined by the issuer." William chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of pure condescension. He didn't feel a single flutter of panic. He was a man worth over $4 million. Credit card glitches were for the middle class. "It's just a security hold, Javier. You know how these international banking algorithms are. They see a charge in Central America, and they panic, run it again, or simply try the secondary platinum card in the file. We have taken the liberty of trying both, sir," Javier replied, the professional smile faltering, revealing a glimmer of genuine concern. "Both were flagged as insufficient funds. In fact, our merchant services representative informed us that your bank has issued a global freeze on the routing numbers associated with the accounts. The ambient noise of the resort, the crashing waves, the distant steel drum music, the calls of the tropical birds seemed to instantly mute. The color drained from William's face, leaving his tan looking suddenly sallow and sickly. He stood up so quickly his knees struck the heavy teak table, knocking his chair backward against the terrace railing. "That is impossible," William snapped, his voice tight. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his linen trousers and frantically dialed Vanessa's private international number. He held the phone to his ear, his heart beginning to hammer a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. "We're sorry. The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." A cold, sharp spike of absolute terror pierced his chest. "I need to make a call. From my laptop. I will be down to the front desk in 10 minutes to clear this up," William barked at the manager, his polished demeanor shattering completely. He didn't wait for a response. He shoved past Javier, rushing into the air-conditioned chill of his ocean view suite. He threw open his leather briefcase on the king-sized bed, his hands shaking so violently he could barely type his password into his laptop. He connected to his secure, encrypted VPN, a protocol Vanessa had insisted they use to prevent the IRS from tracking their IP addresses. He navigated to the secure portal for Butterfield Bank in the Cayman Islands. He entered his username. He entered his complex string of passwords. He waited as the two-factor authentication loaded. The screen refreshed. He stared at the high-resolution monitor until his vision physically blurred, the numbers burning themselves into his retinas. Primary account balance, $0. Secondary holding account balance, $0. William let out a choked, animalistic gasp. He clicked frantically on the transaction history tab, his index finger punishing the trackpad. There it was, executed exactly 48 hours ago. An outward, irrevocable wire transfer of $4.2 million. The destination routing number belonged to a private wealth management branch of UBS in Geneva, Switzerland. The receiving account name wasn't Blue Heron Holdings. It wasn't William Sullivan. It was an account registered under Vanessa's maiden name. She had taken it. She had taken absolutely everything. The realization crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. The $4 million he had systematically stolen from his own life. The money he had betrayed his loyal wife to secure. The fortune he had laundered through a web of lies, it was gone, evaporated into the impenetrable fortress of the Swiss Alps. He had thought he was the mastermind playing a brilliant game of chess, but he had merely been a pawn, manipulated by a younger, far more ruthless grifter who had waited for him to do all the heavy lifting before stealing the prize. William spent the next 4 hours in a state of absolute, manic, suffocating desperation. He paced the length of the luxurious suite like a caged predator. He called his old corporate attorneys in Chicago, men he had played golf with for a decade. None of them took his calls. His reputation in the city was already toxic ash. He tried to contact his former business partner, Paul. The call went straight to voicemail. He even, in a moment of pure, pathetic weakness, dialed his son Thomas's number. The line rang once and clicked into a blocked caller tone. He was completely and utterly isolated. He was stranded in a foreign country, surrounded by luxury he could no longer afford, with nothing to his name but the cash in his bespoke leather wallet and a digital return ticket to the United States. By sunset, the illusion of his grand new life had entirely dissolved. He was forced to march down to the mahogany front desk of the Las Terrazas resort to face the music. To appease the furious general manager and settle his staggering week-long bill, William had to unbuckle his heavy, solid gold Patek Philippe watch from his wrist and hand it over. The humiliation was a physical agony. He left his expensive Italian leather luggage behind in the lobby, carrying only a small nylon duffel bag containing a change of clothes and his passport. He managed to secure a seat on a loud, cramped puddle jumper flight back to Belize City using the last few $100s of emergency cash he kept hidden in his shoe. From there, His descent into the reality of the working class he had so deeply despised began. There were no first-class lounges. There were no complimentary champagne flutes. William spent the next 30 hours in a brutal, degrading gauntlet of budget travel. He flew from Belize City to Miami, sitting in the cramped, non-reclining middle seat of a discount airline, his knees crushed against the plastic seatback in front of him. A toddler in the row behind him kicked his seat relentlessly for 3 hours. He sweat through his ruined linen shirt, his stomach churning with a mixture of hunger, exhaustion, and a toxic, murderous rage directed entirely at Vanessa. In his narcissistic mind, he didn't spare a single thought for Eleanor. His former wife was a non-entity, a solved problem. He assumed she was currently sitting in a cheap, rented apartment in the Chicago suburbs, crying over her lost kitchen. His entire universe was intensely focused on the betrayal of his mistress. He had one card left to play, one tangible asset that had not been liquidated: the coastal estate in Camden, Maine. He had deliberately hidden the purchase of the architectural marvel from everyone, funneling the stolen marital funds through the Blue Heron LLC. He knew Vanessa had planned to eventually flip the property to a tech billionaire, but it was still standing. It was real estate. If he could just get to Maine, he could corner her. If she wasn't there, he could at least occupy the property, change the locks, and use it as leverage to force a negotiation. It was a multi-million-dollar fortress, and it belonged to his LLC. After a grueling 6-hour layover sleeping on the dirty carpet of the Atlanta airport terminal, his credit card sparking and failing at every automated kiosk, he finally arrived in Boston. He didn't have the funds to rent a car. Instead, he found himself standing in the diesel-fumed bay of the South Station bus terminal, handing over his last wrinkled $20 bills for a Greyhound ticket headed north. The bus ride from Massachusetts to the jagged coastline of Maine was a slow, agonizing torture. The heater on the bus was broken, and the late October weather had turned violently hostile. A vicious nor'easter was brewing off the Atlantic coast. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and sleet began to aggressively pelt the dirty windows of the bus. William sat shivering in the back row, his thin, tropical clothing offering zero protection against the seeping, damp cold of New England. The smell of wet wool, stale coffee, and unwashed bodies made his stomach heave, but he forced himself to stay awake, fueled by pure, unadulterated vengeance. It was nearly midnight when the bus finally hissed to a halt at a desolate, dimly lit gas station at the edge of the Camden town limits. William stepped off the bus, and the freezing, driving rain hit him like a physical blow. The wind howled off the ocean, cutting through his linen shirt and instantly chilling him to the bone. He had 3 miles to go. There were no taxis. There were no ride shares. He began to walk. Every step was a masterclass in suffering. His expensive, thin-soled leather loafers, designed for the manicured sidewalks of the magnificent Mile, were instantly ruined by the thick, sucking mud of the shoulder. Blisters formed and ruptured on his heels within the first mile. His muscles, unaccustomed to anything more strenuous than a round of golf in a motorized cart, cramped and seized in the freezing temperature. His heart hammered dangerously against his ribs, a tight, squeezing pain radiating down his left arm. But he pushed through it, muttering Vanessa's name under his breath like a dark, protective incantation. It took him 2 agonizing hours to reach the turnoff for Whispering Pines Road. He limped up the unpaved, deeply rutted driveway, the dense canopy of ancient evergreens blocking out what little ambient light the storm provided. He was operating purely on adrenaline and spite. Finally, the tree line broke, and the massive wrought-iron security gates loomed in the darkness before him. William stumbled to the stone pillar housing the digital call box. His fingers were numb, blue, and bleeding from where he had fallen in the gravel miles back. He reached out and punched his secure, 6-digit master code into the keypad. He waited for the satisfying mechanical groan of the gates swinging open to welcome the master of the house. Instead, the keypad flashed a harsh, unforgiving red light. Access denied. William blinked. rainwater stinging his eyes. He wiped his face with his ruined sleeve and tried again, pressing the numbers with deliberate, aggressive force. Access denied. No, he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. No, no, no. He slammed his fists against the call box, screaming into the storm. She had changed the codes. She had locked him out of his own property. The sheer audacity of it broke something fundamental inside his mind. He was not a man who was denied entry. He was the owner. He was the creator of this wealth, driven by a feral, primal desperation. The 65-year-old man grabbed the slick, freezing iron bars of the gate. He hoisted himself up, his dress shoes slipping uselessly against the wet metal. He scraped his forearms raw against the decorative iron spikes at the top, tearing his shirt and leaving smears of blood on the gate as he threw his center of gravity over the barrier. He fell heavily onto the gravel driveway on the other side, twisting his ankle with a sickening pop. He cried out in pain, lying in the freezing mud for a long moment, the relentless rain beating down on his back. But he could see it, just up the winding drive, perched on the cliffside. The glass house. It was glowing warmly in the darkness, a beacon of immense wealth and shelter against the hostile night. Someone was inside. He forced himself to his feet, dragging his injured leg, shivering so violently his teeth audibly clacked together. William Sullivan began the final, excruciating march toward the heavy oak front door. He was going to break the glass if he had to. He was going to tear the house apart with his bare, bleeding hands to find her. He dragged himself onto the polished concrete of the wraparound porch, raised his battered fist, and began to pound violently against the solid wood. Inside the architectural marvel perched on the Camden cliffside, the radiant floor heating pulsed with a steady, comforting warmth. Eleanor sat in the center of the sprawling, minimalist living room, enveloped in the plush cushions of the pale sectional sofa. A fire roared in the monolithic stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished concrete floors. In her hands, she held a steaming mug of Earl Grey tea, its bergamot scent mingling with the faint, lingering trace of Vanessa's expensive vanilla perfume, a ghost that Eleanor had decided to let fade naturally rather than scrub away. For the past 45 minutes, Eleanor had been watching the high-definition security monitors mounted discreetly on the wall beside the wet bar. The night vision cameras, installed just a week prior by a private security firm out of Boston, provided a crystal-clear broadcast of the misery unfolding outside. She had watched William stumble up the pitch-black, deeply rutted driveway. She had watched his pathetic, desperate attempt to scale the wrought iron gate, the infrared lenses capturing the exact moment his expensive linen trousers tore on the decorative spikes. She had watched him fall into the freezing mud, writhing in pain before dragging his injured leg the rest of the way. Now, the heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through the cavernous foyer. He was striking the solid oak front door with what sounded like a bloody, desperate fist. Eleanor did not rush. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, savoring the complex warmth sliding down her throat. She set the ceramic mug down on a coaster, smoothed the fabric of her tailored cashmere sweater, and walked unhurriedly toward the entryway. She paused in front of the console table, resting her hand lightly on the thick leather portfolio sitting on top of it. The pounding grew more frantic. "Vanessa, open the door! I know you're in there!" His voice screamed, muffled by the 3-inch thick wood and the howling nor'easter. Eleanor reached out, her fingers closing around the brass deadbolt. She turned it with a loud, definitive click and pulled the heavy door inward. The storm violently breached the threshold. A gust of freezing, sleet-filled wind rushed into the foyer, bringing with it the metallic smell of ozone, wet earth, and the sharp tang of sweat and blood. William practically collapsed into the entryway, his ruined, mud-caked loafers skidding uselessly on the smooth floor. He fell to his hands and knees, shivering so violently, his teeth chattered in a rapid, audible rhythm. Water poured from his gray hair, pooling on the immaculate floor beneath him. "You treacherous," he gasped out, his chest heaving as he stared at the floor, fighting for oxygen. "Where is it? Where did you put the money, you little—" He froze. The voice that answered him did not belong to the 35-year-old designer he had expected. "The mud on your shoes is ruining my floor, William," Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly level, devoid of any anger, malice, or pity. It was the voice of a woman speaking to a stranger who had accidentally wandered onto her property. William's head snapped up. He blinked, the rainwater stinging his eyes, his mind struggling to process the impossible geometry of the situation. He stared at the woman standing before him. She looked immaculate, wealthy, and entirely at peace, a stark, jarring contrast to the broken, weeping woman he had abandoned in Illinois a month ago. "Eleanor?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic wheeze. He looked wildly around the cavernous, softly lit foyer, then back up at her. "What? What are you doing here? How did you find this place? Where is Vanessa?" Vanessa developed a sudden, passionate affinity for the Swiss Alps, Eleanor replied casually, leaning back against the sleek glass railing of the staircase. "She caught a flight to Geneva shortly after I arrived, and, from what I understand, she took the entirety of your Cayman Islands portfolio with her." William let out a choked sound, a cross between a sob and a cough, and slumped against the heavy oak doorframe. His reality was shattering in real time. You know, I know everything, William," Eleanor said, stepping slightly closer, her eyes locked onto his. "I know about the dummy corporations registered in Delaware. I know about the offshore wire transfers. I know about attorney Robert Klein cooking the books for you. I know you forged my signature on a power of attorney to leverage the Oak Park house, extracting $600,000 in equity and leaving me facing foreclosure just 3 days after my 60th birthday." William's survival instincts, the arrogant, manipulative reflexes of a man who had lied his way through a 40-year career kicked in. He tried to push himself up, leaning heavily against the wall, trying to reassert some semblance of authority. "Eleanor, you have to listen to me," he started, his voice adopting that familiar, patronizing tone he had used for decades. "She played me. She manipulated the accounting. I didn't mean to leave you with nothing. We can fix this. You and we can hire the best international litigators. We can track her down in Switzerland and get our money back. But I need you to help me." "Our money?" Eleanor laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. "There is no our anymore. You made sure of that when you hired that process server. You severed the partnership. You burned the bridge to the ground while I was still standing on it. This house," he growled, his desperation curdling into rage. He gestured weakly at the glass walls. "This house was bought with my money. It belongs to my LLC. You are trespassing. Get out before I call the local police." Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply turned, picked up the thick leather portfolio from the console table, and dropped it onto the floor directly at his bleeding hands. "Read it," she commanded. He bent down with a groan of agony and flipped the folder open. His bloodshot eyes scanned the heavy parchment. His hands began to shake even harder, crinkling the paper. "The LLC transferred sole membership," he mumbled, his eyes widening in absolute horror. "To you. She signed the entire holding company over to you. I gave her a choice," Eleanor explained smoothly, watching his empire turn to ash in his hands. "Hand over the LLC and the property, or I press send on an email containing the digital ledgers she carelessly left on the office laptop." The email was addressed to the IRS Fraud Division and the FBI. "I promise to expose both her embezzlement and your wire fraud. She chose the Swiss accounts and her freedom. I chose the real estate." "You can't do this," he shouted, throwing the folder against the glass staircase. "This is my house. I built this life. I earned this." "No," Eleanor corrected, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce, and terrifying fire. "I built that life. I balanced your ledgers until 2 in the morning. I raised your 3 children practically alone while you entertained clients and played golf. I created the stable foundation that allowed you to succeed. You tried to steal my equity to fund a tropical fantasy with a woman who despised you. And now, William, you have exactly what you left me with." She stepped right up to him. He was 6 inches taller, but in that moment, he shrank beneath her gaze. "Absolutely nothing," she whispered. "Eleanor, please," he begged, the last remnants of his ego evaporating, leaving only a hollow, terrified old man. "I have nowhere to go. My accounts are frozen. My cards are blocked. I haven't eaten in 2 days. It's freezing outside. Just let me stay the night. I'll sleep on the floor. Please." Eleanor looked at the man she had loved for 4 decades. She searched the deepest corners of her heart for a shred of pity, a lingering ghost of affection, or even a flicker of hesitation. She found nothing. He was a complete stranger to her, now a thief who had broken into her life and taken everything of value, leaving her to starve. "There's a bus shelter back on the coastal highway," Eleanor said softly. "It's about a 3-mile walk." She reached into the pocket of her tailored cashmere slacks. She withdrew a small silver money clip. Slowly, deliberately, she peeled off 4 crisp $20 bills, then 4 single-dollar bills. Finally, she dug into the bottom of her pocket and extracted a dime and 2 copper pennies. She knelt slightly, placing the exact sum of $84.12 onto the floor, right next to his bleeding hand. "This is exactly what you left me to survive the rest of my life," Eleanor said, her voice echoing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "I suggest you budget it carefully." She stepped back, grabbed the heavy oak door, and pushed it open, letting the freezing, violent storm blow back into the foyer. "Goodbye, William." He looked at her, his eyes hollow and defeated. Then, he looked down at the money on the floor. Slowly, agonizingly, the former millionaire bent down, scraped the $84.12 off the wet concrete, and limped backward out the door, disappearing into the freezing rain. Eleanor closed the door. She slid the heavy deadbolt into place with a satisfying, metallic thud. She walked back to the living room, picked up her Earl Grey tea, and sat down to watch the storm rage against the impenetrable glass of her fortress, finally safe and finally free. The story of Eleanor's triumphant reclamation stands as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with absolute betrayal. When faced with catastrophic financial and emotional ruin meticulously orchestrated by her former partner, she refused to succumb to the role of a passive victim. Instead, she channeled her profound grief into a sharp, unforgiving clarity, turning the very instruments of his deception against him. This narrative serves as a stark, dramatic reminder that true equity in a partnership is built on trust, and when that trust is weaponized, the subsequent fallout is absolute. Ultimately, the story delivers a profound and satisfying sense of karmic justice. The architect of her destruction was entirely ruined by his own greed, outmaneuvered by the very woman he deemed expendable. Eleanor didn't just survive the ashes of her 40-year marriage. She used them to forge an impenetrable foundation for the rest of her life.